When the final appeal was denied and the prison guards led him away, all he asked for was one last moment with his loyal companion. He knew his fate was sealed, but the simple act of seeing his dog ignited a flicker of hope, not for himself, but for a profound truth that would soon be unveiled, shaking the very foundations of justice and mercy. What transpired in those fleeting moments before the inevitable reshaped the lives of everyone present, revealing a depth of human connection and a pursuit of truth that transcended the confines of a prison cell. The air in cell block C was thick with the scent of stale concrete and unspoken despair, a weight that pressed down on every inmate, every guard, and every silent corner. Inside cell 14, Elias Thorne sat on his cot, the rough wool blanket a meager barrier against the cold stone floor and the even colder reality of his impending execution. His gaze was fixed on the single, narrow window, where a sliver of the late afternoon sun, filtered through the thick grates, cast a fleeting pattern on the wall. For months, that light had been his only connection to the world outside, a world that had condemned him, yet a world he desperately clung to for one last, improbable wish. Elias was a man etched by time and sorrow, his face a roadmap of hardship and quiet resilience. His once vibrant blue eyes, now clouded with a deep-seated weariness, still held a spark of gentle kindness that belied the crime he was accused of. He wasn't a violent man. His hands, though calloused from years of working the land, had always been more accustomed to tending to life than taking it. Yet, here he was, accused of a brutal act he vehemently denied, trapped in a legal labyrinth that had swallowed him whole. The justice system, in its relentless pursuit of truth, had, in his case, stumbled, caught in the shadows of circumstantial evidence and a community's collective grief. His mind, however, wasn't consumed by anger or bitterness, but by a singular, aching desire. His last wish. It wasn't for a reprieve, a miracle, or even a final plea of innocence. It was for Buddy, his faithful German shepherd, the only true constant in a life that had spiraled out of his control. Buddy wasn't just a pet. He was family, a silent confidant, a loyal shadow that had followed Elias through thick and thin, a living embodiment of unconditional love. The thought of Buddy, waiting patiently by the gate of their small, isolated farm, his ears perked, his tail wagging with joyous anticipation, was a pain deeper than any physical confinement. He could almost feel the rough fur against his palm, the wet nudge of Buddy's nose, the comforting weight of his head on his lap. The prison warden, Arthur Hayes, a man whose stern demeanor was a well-honed defense against the daily tragedies he witnessed, entered the cell block. His face was a mask of professional detachment, but behind his eyes, a flicker of something akin to empathy often surfaced, quickly suppressed, like a flame doused by a sudden gust of wind. He carried a heavy key ring that jingled with every deliberate step, each clang echoing the inexorable march of time. He stopped before Elias's cell, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. He had seen countless men in this final hour, each with their own desperate pleas, their own fading hopes. But Elias was different. There was a quiet dignity about him, a genuine sorrow that seemed to emanate from a place untouched by malice. Thorne, Warden Hayes' voice was gruff but not unkind. Your final request has been granted. Elias's head snapped up, a jolt of raw emotion coursing through him. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his throat tight with a surge of relief and gratitude. Buddy, he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. Warden Hayes nodded slowly. He's in the visiting room. You have 15 minutes. A wave of profound emotion washed over Elias. It was a small mercy, a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of his impending doom, but it meant everything. He rose from the cot, his limbs stiff, but his spirit suddenly imbued with a fragile lightness. As the guards led him down the long, sterile corridor, the silence of the prison was punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of their boots and the distant clanging of a metal door. Elias's heart pounded, a drumbeat of anticipation. He wasn't walking towards his end. He was walking toward a reunion, a final communion with the one creature who had never judged him, never doubted his innocence. The visiting room was a stark, utilitarian space, usually reserved for the strained conversations between inmates and their families, separated by a thick pane of glass. But today the glass was gone, replaced by a simple wooden table and 2 chairs. And there, sitting patiently by one of the chairs, was Buddy. He was older, his muzzle flecked with more gray, but his eyes, those intelligent, soulful eyes, were unmistakably his. As Elias entered, Buddy's ears perked, and a low whine escaped his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that cut through the somber atmosphere like a beacon. His tail began to thump against the floor, a soft, hopeful rhythm. Elias knelt, oblivious to the guards, oblivious to the warden, his heart overflowing. Buddy, sensing his presence, rose and padded towards him, his steps hesitant at first, then quickening until he was pressing his large head into Elias's chest. Elias wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in Buddy's fur, inhaling the familiar scent of earth and dog. Tears, long held back, finally flowed freely, hot and raw against Buddy's warm coat. Buddy whimpered, licking Elias's face with frantic affection, as if trying to soothe away his pain, to reassure him that everything would be all right. It was a profound connection, a silent language of love and understanding that transcended words. In that moment, the sterile prison room faded, replaced by memories of sun-drenched fields, of long walks through whispering forests, of quiet evenings by a crackling fire, Buddy always by his side. The guards shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying a flicker of emotion they rarely allowed themselves to show. Even Warden Hayes, who had witnessed countless goodbyes, found a knot forming in his throat. This wasn't just a man saying goodbye to his pet. It was a soul finding solace, a last anchor in a sea of despair. The profound bond between man and dog was palpable, a silent testament to the unwavering loyalty that existed outside the rigid boundaries of justice and law. As Elias held Buddy, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He was ready, not for death, but for whatever truth lay beyond, comforted by the unwavering love of his truest friend. He knew he had to make the most of these precious moments, not just for himself, but for Buddy, to convey a final message of love and reassurance. He stroked Buddy's head, his fingers tracing the familiar lines of his ears, his mind already formulating how to make this short, final encounter meaningful, not just for himself, but for a greater purpose he still couldn't fully comprehend. As Elias held Buddy, the ticking of the clock in the visiting room seemed to amplify, each second a precious, fading beat. He pulled back slightly, looking into Buddy's trusting eyes, a silent plea passing between them. He knew he had to gather his thoughts, to convey what needed to be said, not through words, but through the profound connection they shared. He gently rubbed Buddy's ears, a familiar gesture that always calmed the dog. Buddy, in turn, leaned into his touch, his whole body trembling slightly with suppressed excitement and a deep, intuitive understanding of the gravity of the moment. Warden Hayes, observing from a respectful distance, noticed the shift in Elias. The raw anguish that had initially consumed him was now replaced by a quiet resolve. It was as if the simple act of touching his dog had grounded him, preparing him not for despair, but for something else entirely. The guards, too, seemed to lower their defenses, their hardened expressions softening as they witnessed the tender exchange. It was a rare glimpse into the human spirit, stripped bare of pretense, revealing the purest form of love. Elias's gaze drifted to the warden, then back to Buddy. He remembered something, a small, insignificant detail that had always been a part of their routine. Whenever Elias was troubled or deep in thought, he would absent-mindedly rub a specific spot behind Buddy's left ear. It was a comfort to him, and Buddy always responded by nudging his hand, a silent request for more. And sometimes, when Elias was truly in distress, Buddy would respond by digging at the ground with his paw, a strange, almost nervous habit. It was a quirk that only Elias knew, a secret language between them. He began to stroke Buddy's fur again, this time with a deliberate slowness, his fingers tracing the contours of Buddy's head. When he reached the spot behind Buddy's left ear, he pressed gently, rubbing in a circular motion. Buddy responded immediately, his eyes closing in contentment, his tail wagging a slow, rhythmic beat. But then, as Elias continued the specific motion, a subtle change occurred. Buddy's tail wagged faster, and he began to nudge Elias's hand. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, he started to paw at the floor, a soft, scratching sound against the polished linoleum. It was the digging. Elias felt a sudden jolt, a surge of adrenaline through his veins. This wasn't just a nervous habit. This was Buddy's signal, a specific response to a specific trigger. It was a code, a communication they had unwittingly developed over years, a pattern of behavior that was unique to them. Elias looked at Buddy, a flash of something akin to hope igniting in his eyes, a desperate, final understanding dawning upon him. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that Buddy was trying to tell him something vital, something that had been buried deep within the innocent world of their shared routine. He continued to rub the spot behind Buddy's ear, watching the dog intently. Buddy's pawing became more pronounced, a persistent, almost urgent scratching. His eyes, still full of love, now also held a strange intensity, as if he too was trying to convey a message, to break through the barrier of understanding. Elias's mind raced, sifting through memories, searching for the meaning behind this specific response. What could it be? What had Buddy been doing? What had he been present for that could be significant to his case? Then it hit him, a memory, long suppressed by the trauma of his arrest and the overwhelming weight of his legal battle, resurfaced with startling clarity. The day of the crime. He had been out in the back fields, tending to a broken fence, and Buddy had been with him as always. But then, Buddy had suddenly darted off, barking furiously, disappearing into the dense woods that bordered their property. Elias had called for him, but Buddy hadn't returned until much later, covered in mud, a strange urgency in his usually playful demeanor. At the time, Elias had dismissed it as Buddy chasing a rabbit, or perhaps getting into a tussle with a wild animal. But now, in the sterile silence of the prison visiting room, that memory pulsed with a new, terrifying significance. But he wasn't just digging. He was acting out a memory, a forgotten moment that held the key to Elias's innocence. Elias looked at Warden Hayes, his eyes wide with a desperate, newfound conviction. "Warden," he said, his voice stronger now, imbued with a sudden, raw urgency. "Buddy, he knows something. He was there. He saw something." Warden Hayes, usually unflappable, was momentarily taken aback by the intensity in Elias's voice, by the sheer, unshakable belief that radiated from the man. He had seen inmates in their final moments grasp at straws, invent fantastical stories, but this felt different. The dog's peculiar behavior, the man's sudden, absolute certainty, it all created an unsettling dissonance in the warden's carefully constructed world of procedure and protocol. He looked at Buddy, who continued his persistent, almost frantic pawing, as if digging for a hidden truth. "What are you talking about, Thorne?" the warden asked, his voice betraying a hint of curiosity, a crack in his professional facade. Elias knelt closer to Buddy, his hand still on the dog, as if drawing strength from him. The day it happened," he began, his voice gaining momentum as the pieces clicked into place. Buddy ran into the woods. He was barking, and when he came back, he was agitated. I dismissed it. I thought he was just being a dog. But now I know. He was trying to tell me something. He saw something in those woods. The warden's gaze hardened, a flicker of doubt entering his eyes. He had heard countless desperate theories, but the image of the dog, persistently pawing at the floor, was strangely compelling. Elias continued, his words tumbling out, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. "There's a clearing deep in those woods, an old, overgrown path, rarely used. Buddy always loved to explore there. He always found things, small animals, sometimes even old discarded tools from the lumberjacks that used to work these parts decades ago. He was there, Warden. He was there, and he saw what really happened. He knows. The warden's eyes narrowed, a struggle playing out on his face between skepticism and a burgeoning sense of unease. He had a duty, a strict adherence to the law, but he also had a conscience, a nagging feeling that something about the Thorn case had always felt off. The lack of direct evidence, the hurried trial, the community's demand for swift justice, it had all left a subtle, unsettling residue. He looked at Buddy, who, as if understanding the weight of the conversation, stopped his pawing and simply sat, his intelligent eyes fixed first on Elias, then on the warden, a silent, powerful plea in their depths. The 15 minutes were almost up. The guards began to shift, a silent signal that time was running out. But Warden Hayes remained, caught in the undeniable pull of Elias's conviction and the extraordinary silent testimony of a loyal dog. The air in the visiting room grew taut, stretched thin between the ticking clock and the silent, desperate plea of a man facing his final moments. Warden Hayes, a man of rules and unwavering protocol, found himself in an unfamiliar emotional landscape. He had witnessed every shade of human despair within these walls, but this was different. Elias's conviction, fueled by the seemingly intelligent actions of his loyal dog, pricked at something deep within the warden's hardened exterior. He glanced at the lead guard, a silent acknowledgement of the rapidly dwindling time. The protocol dictated immediate removal, but a profound, unquantifiable feeling held him rooted to the spot. "Thorn," Warden Hayes finally said, his voice a low rumble, "even if what you say about the dog is true, how does it help now? We have a conviction. Evidence was presented. This is highly irregular." He gestured vaguely at Buddy, who had settled beside Elias, his watchful eyes fixed on the warden, as if understanding the stakes. The dog's stillness was almost unnerving, a silent counterpoint to the growing tension in the room. Elias looked at the warden, his gaze steady, devoid of anger or desperation, replaced instead by a singular focus. "Warden, please, just send a team to the woods, to the old lumberjack path, just past the clearing on my property. Buddy, he'll show them. He knows what he saw. He'll lead them to it." Elias's voice was hoarse with emotion, but unshaking. He knew this was his only chance, a final, audacious gamble based on nothing but the unwavering loyalty of his dog and a gut feeling. He was no longer pleading for himself, but for the truth, for a justice that had somehow eluded him. He felt an almost unbearable weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a surge of defiant hope. Warden Hayes hesitated, his mind warring with itself. His years of service had instilled in him a deep respect for the letter of the law, for the sanctity of a verdict. But a nagging doubt, a quiet whisper of intuition, had always lingered around the Thorn case. There had been no eyewitnesses, only circumstantial evidence that, while strong, had left certain questions unanswered. And now this, a dog, seemingly communicating a vital clue. It was absurd, outlandish even. Yet, looking at Elias's earnest face, and then at Buddy, whose silent presence exuded an almost human intelligence, the warden felt a pull he couldn't ignore. He glanced at the prison clock. Barely 5 minutes remained. The final preparations for the execution would already be underway. To delay, to even consider Elias's plea, would be an unprecedented breach of protocol, a professional risk that could end his career. But what if Elias was telling the truth? What if an innocent man was about to walk to his death, and the key to his exoneration lay in the silent testimony of his canine companion? The moral weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than any set of keys he'd ever carried. The lead guard cleared his throat, a subtle reminder of their duty. "Warden, time's nearly up." Warden Hayes held up a hand, silencing him. He walked over to Elias, kneeling down, so he was at eye level with both the man and the dog. He looked deep into Elias's eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of a desperate fabrication. What he found was only raw, unvarnished truth, mixed with a profound sorrow. And then he looked at Buddy, who met his gaze with an unwavering intensity, almost as if he was pleading on Elias's behalf. "Thorn," the warden said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can't promise anything. This is extraordinary, but I will send a team. A small one. They will go to the location you described. If they find anything at all that casts new doubt on your conviction, I will personally see to it that your execution is stayed, pending further investigation." The words, once spoken, hung in the air, audacious and fragile. He was putting his career, his reputation, on the line, based on a prisoner's last wish and a dog's strange behavior. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled Elias's knees, washed over him. He felt a surge of gratitude towards the warden, a man he had once seen as merely an enforcer of his fate. "Thank you, warden," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He turned to Buddy, burying his face in the dog's for one last time. "Go on, boy. You'll show them. You'll show them the truth." He whispered words of love and encouragement, a silent promise that their bond would transcend even the walls of death. As the guards gently pulled Elias away, Buddy let out a low, mournful whine, a sound that tore at the hearts of everyone present. He watched Elias being led from the room, his eyes following him until the door closed, leaving him alone in the sterile silence. Warden Hayes stood for a moment, watching the dog, then made his decision. He pulled out his radio, his voice firm and decisive. "I need a small team, immediately. An AK-9 unit. We're going to the Thorn property, specifically the old lumberjack path in the woods just past the clearing. And give me the lead investigator from the Thorn case on the line now." The finality of the execution order, which had been hanging over the prison like a shroud, now felt strangely uncertain, suspended by the fragile thread of a dog's memory and a warden's leap of faith. What they would find in those forgotten woods, guided by Buddy, was about to reshape everything. The woods surrounding Elias Thorne's property were ancient and dense, their canopy a thick, green shroud that kept the forest floor in perpetual twilight, even in the late afternoon. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of rich earth and decaying leaves. Warden Hayes, dressed in a hastily donned field jacket, led the small contingent of officers, his stride purposeful, a flicker of nervous energy in his eyes. Beside him trotted Buddy, no longer a mere pet, but a guide, his nose to the ground, his tail occasionally wagging with an almost businesslike focus. The prison canine officer, a seasoned handler named Officer Davies, observed Buddy with a mixture of skepticism and professional curiosity. Even he had to admit, the dog's demeanor was unlike any search animal he'd seen. Buddy wasn't just tracking. He seemed to be on a mission. They followed Buddy along an almost invisible deer trail that eventually widened into a faint, overgrown path. This was the old lumberjack path Elias had described, rarely used since the logging operations ceased decades ago. Branches, heavy with moss, brushed against their faces, and the ground was uneven, covered in fallen leaves and decaying logs. The silence of the forest was broken only by the crunch of their boots, Buddy's occasional whines of excitement, and the hushed, skeptical whispers of the officers. They were deep in the woods now, far from the well-trodden paths, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in fragmented shafts, creating an almost ethereal glow. Suddenly, Buddy stopped dead. He sniffed the air, then let out a low, urgent bark, his tail wagging furiously. He began to paw at a specific spot on the ground, a patch of disturbed earth half hidden by a thicket of ferns and thorny bushes. His digging was frantic now, mirroring the same urgent scratching Elias had observed in the visiting room. Warden Hayes knelt, pushing aside the undergrowth. Beneath the ferns, the ground was softer, as if recently disturbed. Officer Davies, his skepticism momentarily forgotten, joined him, pulling on a pair of gloves. "Looks like something's been buried here, Warden," he muttered, his voice hushed with dawning realization. The other officers moved closer, their earlier cynicism replaced by a growing sense of anticipation. They began to dig, carefully at first, then with more urgency as the earth gave way easily. The soil was loamy and dark, hinting at its recent disturbance. Within minutes, Officer Davies' shovel struck something solid. He scraped away the dirt, revealing a glimmer of metal. It was a small, ornate silver locket, tarnished with age but still recognizable. He carefully unearthed it, holding it up for Warden Hayes to see. Warden Hayes gasped. He knew this locket. It had belonged to the victim, a distinctive piece of jewelry that had been reported missing from the crime scene. Its absence had always been a puzzling detail in the original investigation. But even more significant was what was found beneath it. As they continued to dig, another object emerged, larger and heavier, a blood-stained hunting knife. The hilt was intricately carved, a design that was strikingly unique. This wasn't Elias Thorne's knife. Elias was known for his simple, practical tools, not ornate hunting knives. The warden's mind raced. He remembered the police report, the initial sketch of the weapon, a vague description based on the victim's family's distraught account. This knife, with its distinctive hilt, was unlike anything in the official evidence photos from Elias's property. And the locket, found with the knife, clearly belonged to the victim, connecting it directly to the crime. Buddy, as if sensing the significance of their discovery, let out a triumphant bark, then sat back on his haunches, his eyes fixed on the warden, a silent declaration of, "I told you so." Warden Hayes stood up, the locket and knife clutched in his gloved hands, his face pale with a mixture of shock and profound dread. He looked at the lead investigator from the original case, who had arrived just moments before, guided by the sound of the frantic digging. The investigator's face, initially scowling with annoyance, transformed into one of stunned disbelief as he recognized the items. This changes everything," the investigator stammered, his voice barely audible. "This locket was never found. And this knife, it's not Thorne's. It's different." The implications were staggering. The discovery of these crucial pieces of evidence, hidden away in a remote part of the woods, pointed to a narrative far different from the one that had condemned Elias Thorne. The original investigation, the rush trial, the definitive verdict, all now stood on shaky ground. The presence of these items suggested another perpetrator, someone who had deliberately hidden them to frame Elias, or to simply bury the truth. Warden Hayes looked at Buddy, who now lay calmly at his feet, his mission accomplished. The loyalty of a simple dog had unearthed the truth that the entire justice system had missed. The weight of his decision in the prison visiting room, the risk he had taken, now felt justified, monumental even. He pulled out his radio, his voice firm, resolute. "Get a forensics team out here immediately. And I want an emergency stay of execution for Elias Thorne. Effective immediately." The news rippled through the prison with the speed of wildfire. The execution was stayed. Elias Thorne, moments from his final breath, was pulled back from the precipice. The discovery in the woods, guided by Buddy, led to a re-examination of the entire case. With the new evidence, a fresh investigation was launched. Forensics revealed fingerprints on the knife that did not belong to Elias, and further digging in the area unearthed other disturbing clues that painted a picture of a calculated frame-up. The true perpetrator, a man with a hidden grudge against Elias and a history of violence, was eventually apprehended, his guilt confirmed by the overwhelming new evidence. Elias Thorne was ultimately exonerated, his name cleared, his freedom restored. When he walked out of the prison gates, a free man, the first face he saw was Buddy's. The dog bounded towards him, a joyous whirlwind of fur and wagging tail, leaping into Elias's arms. The reunion was tearful, profound, a testament to an unbreakable bond forged in the crucible of injustice and sustained by unwavering love. Elias knelt, holding Buddy close, a silent promise exchanged between them. Never again would their loyalty be doubted, never again would the truth remain buried. The kindness of a warden, the silent, unwavering testimony of a loyal dog, had not only saved a life, but had also exposed a flaw in the system, reminding everyone that sometimes the simplest connections can illuminate the darkest truths.